What if the quiet hill outside your city was not just a hill, but the rim of an ancient wound? What if the ground beneath your feet once screamed with fire and turned skies black for years? And what if the stories we lost in that smoke still shape who we are? We walk through modern life on paved streets under steady skies, but the earth has not always been so still. Beneath our fields and cities, beneath airports and vineyards and sleepy villages, lie craters so vast and old they no longer look like scars. They look like scenery, but they are not. They are the remains of eruptions that once swallowed civilizations, that turned noon to midnight, that cast kingdoms into silence. On this expedition, you will not just see the past, you will stand in it. We will cross ice-choked calderas in the north. We will dive beneath the Aegean Sea. We will walk the frozen streets of a city that never got to say goodbye. 15 volcanoes, 15 vanished worlds, all still breathing beneath the surface. Hekla, walk softly, because where we are going, the earth remembers, and it has stories left to tell. The ash fell like snow. Thick, relentless, silent. I stood on a bluff of hardened tuff in what is now Sumatra, staring into the ghost of a caldera that once held the heart of a mountain. The air here is warm, but I could almost feel the cold that followed the blast. A volcanic winter, they call it, but winter is too gentle a word. Somewhere beneath my boots, buried beneath layers of compacted ash, are the remnants of a world interrupted. Plants, streams, maybe even footprints. The land remembers what we cannot. 74,000 years ago, Toba erupted, not with a roar, but with a silence so vast it reached the ends of the earth. It spewed more than 2,000 times the material of Mount St. Helens. Its ash blanket covered continents. Its gases choked skies. Sunlight faded. Crops withered before they could ever be sown. The sky must have gone black. We find its fingerprints in the ice of Greenland, in the sediments of the Indian Ocean, in the genetic bottlenecks of our own species. Some scientists believe it nearly ended us, that only a few thousand humans survived that long, dark season. I try to imagine it, not just the eruption, but the years that followed. Imagine being there, a mother crouched beneath a shelter of fronds, cradling a child as snow-like ash falls for days. The air thick, the sun a pale coin behind a veil, water turning sour. Game vanishing. Nothing grows. Every day colder than the last. How do you survive when the world itself recoils? And yet, someone did. Someone made it through the choking dark. Someone whispered stories of fire from the mountain and shadows that covered the sky. Someone passed that fear into legend. And then, it was forgotten, until we found the ash. I found a piece of it myself, just a flake, trapped in a sediment layer far from this place, carried by wind or water or time. It crumbled in my hand, but in that moment, I felt it all. The silence, the collapse, the fragile persistence. There is something haunting about standing where it began. The caldera is quiet now. A lake fills the hollow. Birds sing from nearby trees. But the earth has not forgotten. Neither should we. Toba did not just change landscapes. It may have changed who we are, forced us to adapt, to gather, to seek shelter together. It may have taught us how to survive as a species, at a terrible cost. That's what echoes here. Not just destruction, but rebirth. A fracture in time that shaped the path we walk today. I gathered my things as the sky began to darken. Rain threatened. A reminder, weather still listens to the breath of mountains. This was no ordinary volcano. This was a hinge in history, and it still breathes beneath the lake. The ash may be buried, the memory may be faint, but Toba watches, waiting. For now, the world turns in peace. But once, long ago, the earth held its breath, and the sky was made of ash. The lake was still when I arrived. Silent. Deep. Too calm. Fog hugged the surface like a veil, curling along the forested rim. There was no wind, no birds, only the faint scent of earth and water. Laacher Sea is beautiful, almost serene. But beneath that quiet surface lies one of the most violent secrets of Europe's deep past. 12,900 years ago, this was not a lake. It was a mountain, a restless one. When it finally erupted, the force was staggering. 10 cubic kilometers of magma. Thunder heard across the continent. Ash that drifted all the way to Russia. The sky would have turned amber with soot, the air thick with choking dust. I crouched near the shoreline and brushed away moss and leaves. Underneath, fine layers of pale ash still rest in the soil, some only centimeters thick, but enough to trace the line between two worlds. One before the blast, and one after. Laacher Sea's eruption didn't just scar the land, it may have shifted the course of history itself. This blast happened just as the last ice age was ending. Europe was warming, forests returning, humans and animals thriving. Then, without warning, the skies darkened, temperatures plunged. Glaciers halted their retreat. Something reversed the clock on spring. Some believe the Laacher eruption helped trigger the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions, a chill that lasted over 1,000 years. I followed a narrow path through the trees, where roots twist between stones cracked by ancient heat. You can still feel it if you listen. The earth here exhales. Small bubbles rise from the lake bed. Not much, just whispers. But they are reminders that this is not a dormant place, just a sleeping one. People lived nearby when it blew. They hunted the forests and followed the rivers. And then, in a single night, their world caught fire. Ash rained down for miles. Rivers turned to mud. Crops and game vanished. Whole regions became uninhabitable. We find clues in bones, scattered tools, buried camps, stories told in layers of sediment and silence. Something terrible happened here, and then the forests returned, and the story was lost. Until we found the lake. Standing at its edge, I tried to picture that night. Lightning crackling through a black sky, trees toppling beneath pyroclastic flows, a darkness that swallowed the moon, the scream of the earth opening. And then, in time, stillness. A crater filled with water, forests reclaiming the rim, a lake so calm, it betrays nothing, but the earth remembers. I pressed my hand to the damp ground and felt warmth rising. It is faint, but it is there. The breath of a monster sleeping beneath still water. Laacher Sea is not done. This lake, so beautiful now, once carried fire into the sky, and it may again. We walk across ancient scars every day, unaware. But when you stand where the mountain once roared, you begin to understand. History is not a line, it is a circle. And beneath the quietest places, the loudest truths still burn. The air was thin at the rim, crisp, carried the scent of pine and volcanic dust. Below me stretched a perfect circle of water, deep, still, blue beyond belief. Crater Lake. It is easy to forget that this place was once a mountain, but the earth remembers. 7,700 years ago, Mount Mazama stood tall over the forests of the Pacific Northwest, a proud peak in a land of giants. And then, in one unforgettable moment, it tore itself apart. The eruption did not come gently. It began with tremors, then a column of ash that pierced the sky. Lightning danced through the clouds. The earth shook, and then the summit collapsed. I stood near the edge, tracing my hand over hardened pumice. The stones here are soft and porous, as if the mountain still breathes through them. Around me, silence. Except for the wind that whispered through scorched trees. The land still echoes with what was lost. Villages once stood at the foot of this mountain. People lived in its shadow, hunted its forests, drank from its streams. And then came the fire, the ash, the darkness, They say the blast ejected 50 times more material than Mount St. Helens. The sky would have vanished in smoke, rivers choked with ash, life smothered beneath a storm of stone. I found obsidian shards near the shore, razor sharp, black as night. Tools, perhaps, or offerings, left by people who knew the mountain's moods. To the native Klamath people, this is a sacred place. They remember the story. A battle between spirits of the sky and the underworld. A war that tore the mountain down. Fire, ash, and thunder. And when it ended, the crater filled with tears. And maybe they are right. Because Crater Lake is not just a scar. It is a memory, a mirror, a wound filled with silence. As I descended along the narrow trail, I imagined the moments after the collapse, smoke rising, trees still burning, the stunned quiet that follows devastation, then the rains, then the slow, patient work of time. It took centuries for the lake to form. Snowmelt and rain, layer upon layer, until the crater held something beautiful again. But the earth beneath still moves. This place is not at rest. Beneath the lake lie hot springs, earthquakes, a restless history beneath a calm surface. I dipped my hand into the water. It was cold and clear, but even in its beauty, I felt something ancient, a silence that is never complete, a fire that still flickers deep below. Mount Mazama did not die. It transformed. What once stood as a mountain now sleeps as a lake. But the story it tells is not over. Here, at the edge of a crater, I saw what remains after the sky falls. I saw what endures. Not just the silence, but the rebirth. This is the language of the earth. Eruption, collapse, renewal. And for a brief moment, as the sun dipped behind the rim, I felt it, that the lake and I were both looking into something far older than time, and that the mountain is still watching. The soil was rich, dark, laced with ash and memory. I knelt beside an ancient footprint, frozen in time, left by someone running, maybe fleeing. The impression was shallow, yet sharp, a moment captured beneath layers of volcanic dust. This was not Pompeii. This was older, a disaster before the records, before the empire. This was the Avellino eruption. Around 4,000 years ago, Mount Vesuvius awoke, not with a whisper, but with a roar that shook the bones of the Apennines. Before Rome, before the Republic, before any marble temple cast its shadow, a different world flourished here. I brushed away fine grains of ash. Beneath it, fragments of pottery, pieces of a lost village. A pastoral people once lived in these fields. Farmers, shepherds. They built with wood and clay. They planted wheat and grazed animals on the slopes of the sleeping mountain. Then one day, the sky darkened. There were no warnings, no scholars, no writings, only the earth trembling beneath bare feet, the scent of sulfur riding the wind. Animals grew restless, children clung to their mothers. And then the mountain tore open. Ash began to fall, thick, blinding. The sun vanished, thunder cracked from inside the earth, fire rained from above. The pyroclastic flow moved fast. It rolled through the countryside like a living shadow, hot, merciless. Final. Entire settlements vanished beneath the surge. The trees burned where they stood. Streams boiled. Nothing escaped. And then, silence. I wandered through the remains of a Bronze Age structure. The walls were barely a meter high now, crumbled, charred. But the layout was clear. Rooms, hearths, corridors. Someone lived here. Someone loved here. Someone vanished here. And for centuries, we forgot. The story stayed buried until archaeologists found the footprints. Dozens of them. Men, women, children. A trail etched in ash. They were running, all in the same direction. Away from the mountain. Toward life. We do not know if they made it. Some of the prints vanish suddenly, cut off by a collapsed roof or a wave of pumice. Others continue, as if hope had not yet been extinguished. I traced my fingers over one such print and imagined the fear, the heat, the noise, the knowledge that nothing would be the same again. Unlike Pompeii, there were no mosaics here, no statues, just soil and bones. And yet, it felt more intimate, more human, because this was not a city, it was a home. The Avellino eruption changed the landscape. It buried entire valleys. It pushed cultures to migrate. It shattered the timeline we thought we knew. Some believe the eruption may have echoed through myth. Perhaps it became a whisper in ancient stories of destruction, of divine wrath, of floods and fire. The mountain stands silent now, its peak sharp against the sky. Vesuvius waits, always watching, always capable. As I stood to leave, the wind picked up. Ash spiraled through the air, a reminder that what lies buried is never truly gone. The Avellino eruption is not famous, but its shadow is vast. It tells us that even the quietest corners of history were shaped by fire. And sometimes, it is in the footprints we find the loudest truths. The sea was calm, too calm, as if it remembered what it had taken. I stood on the fractured cliffs of Santorini, where the land curls in a broken circle around a drowned heart. Wind carried salt and silence. Below me, the Caldera stretched wide, deep blue, almost endless. But it was not always water. Long ago, this was Thera, a mountain, a home, a heartbeat of the Aegean. Before the eruption, this island held a thriving civilization. Minoan settlers lived here. They built homes of stone and plaster, painted their walls with dolphins and lilies, laughed in sunlit courtyards, traded with Crete, worshipped in quiet temples. And then, the earth stirred. First came the tremors, light at first, then stronger. Vessels shook, walls cracked, birds vanished from the sky. Then came the fire. The mountain tore itself open. Ash exploded into the stratosphere. Waves of stone and steam hurled skyward. I touched a jagged rock along the cliff's edge. It was warm from the sun, but in my mind, I felt the heat of that day, felt the thunder roll from beneath the earth, felt the moment a civilization watched its world unravel. The eruption was one of the largest in recorded prehistory. Entire towns were buried. The city of Akrotiri lies beneath meters of ash, perfectly preserved. Pots still sit on shelves. Murals still cling to walls, frozen mid-breath. But the people were gone. Unlike Pompeii, there were no bodies, no remains, only absence. As if the island whispered a warning and the people listened. Or perhaps they fled too late and were lost to the waves. Because after the ash came the sea. A series of tsunamis raced across the Aegean. Walls of water struck the Minoan coast. Fields drowned, ports shattered, temples collapsed. Crete staggered. The heart of the Minoan world skipped a beat. Some say this was the beginning of the end. Others say it was Atlantis. I wandered the remains of Akrotiri once, down narrow streets where light barely reaches, past empty doorways and staircases that lead to nowhere. The dust clung to everything. It felt like walking through a held breath. Thera's eruption did not just destroy, it changed climate. It disrupted trade, it shifted power. But what haunts me most is not the scale, it is the silence. A people who painted their walls with joy, whose hands shaped beauty from clay, whose lives echoed through these hills gone in an instant. And yet, their story remains. Etched in frescoes, carved in obsidian, whispered in legend. I sat near the edge of the caldera, watching the sun dip into the sea. The light turned the water gold. For a moment, it looked like the mountain was returning, rising from its watery grave. But the volcano sleeps. For now, beneath the waves, the fire still burns. The magma chamber stirs. The Earth remembers, and so do we. Thera was not just an eruption. It was a mirror held up to civilization. A question asked by the Earth. How fragile are we? How fast can paradise vanish? The wind carried my thoughts out to sea, toward a past swallowed by flame and tide. And I knew, as I walked away, that the story of Thera is not done. It waits, beneath water, beneath ash, waiting to be heard again. The wind howled low across the ridge, cold, sharp, restless. I stood on the black slopes of Mount Hekla, wrapped in a silence broken only by the gusts. Beneath my boots, the ground was rough, with ancient pumice and shattered stone. This place has a reputation. The locals call it the gateway to hell, and standing there I could understand why. But this was not just myth. This was history, buried in frost and ash. Hekla has erupted many times, but one event carved its name deep into the story of the world. Around 1159 years before the Common Era, the earth shuddered, the sky dimmed, crops failed, and far beyond Iceland, people began to suffer. This was Hekla 3. The eruption was violent. Towering columns of ash and gas rose into the sky, reaching the stratosphere. Volcanic particles scattered across the atmosphere, reflecting sunlight away from the earth. The result was brutal. A sudden drop in global temperatures, a volcanic winter. Famine spread, rivers slowed, harvests failed, and in regions far from Iceland, civilization staggered. I reached down and scooped a handful of brittle ash from the earth. It crumbled like dry parchment. These fragments carried on the wind for thousands of miles. They settled on distant lands, invisible but devastating. Some historians believe Hekla 3 helped trigger the late Bronze Age collapse, a time when empires fell, trade routes withered, palaces burned. Across the Mediterranean, chaos bloomed in silence. And here, in the north, the source of that silence still smolders. I moved slowly along a ridge of fractured basalt. The mountain loomed behind me, vast and quiet. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something waiting. There are no ruins here, no cities buried, no statues or temples, just stone, ice, wind. But the impact was global. Hekla did not bury towns in lava. It buried the future. It turned growing seasons into graves. It turned stable kingdoms into stories. Imagine a priest in Egypt, watching the Nile run low, and the stars shift in unfamiliar patterns. Imagine a farmer in Anatolia, standing in a frost-covered field in the middle of summer. Imagine leaders trying to make sense of the sudden cold, the failing crops, the unrest that followed. And all the while, the mountain stood here, unseen, unknown, but responsible. That is the power of a volcano. It does not need to be near to leave a mark. It only needs to speak once, loud enough. As I stood at the edge of a fumarole, steam rose from a crack in the earth. Warmth drifted upward, a reminder that the fire still moves below. Hekla has not gone quiet. It breathes in cycles, waiting, watching. And we forget, until the sky grows dark again. This was no eruption of legend. This was a turning point, hidden beneath snow and time. A change that came without warning. A force that shifted the rhythm of the world. Hekla 3 did not just end seasons, it ended certainties. And in its shadow, we remember how fragile the balance truly is. I left the ridge with ash in my hands and wind in my ears, the path behind me already fading. But the cold and the silence remain. The wind carried a chill even in the sun, not from the air, but from the ground itself, from the memory buried in the stone. I stood inside a caldera so vast, it felt like a scar carved into the bones of the earth. Steep walls rose around me, jagged, silent, watching. This was Aniakchak, Tucked into the Alaskan peninsula, far from trade routes or palaces, this volcano might seem remote, but 3,500 years ago, it roared with such force that even distant lands felt its breath. The eruption that shaped this place was not gentle. It was not subtle. It was sudden, explosive, violent. I walked across the crater floor, where grasses and lichens now stretch in quiet defiance, but the land is still cracked and stained. Pools of sulfur hiss faintly in the low morning light. You can feel the pulse beneath your feet, faint, steady, as if the volcano never truly went quiet. When Aniakchak erupted, it ejected more than 50 cubic kilometers of material. Ash blanketed the region, the sky went dark, rivers boiled, wildlife vanished. And in the silence that followed, the world shifted. What makes Aniakchak extraordinary is not just its violence, it is its reach. Some scientists link this eruption to sudden global climate changes, droughts, crop failures, a shift in weather patterns as far away as China and the Middle East. Some believe it may be connected to a mysterious cooling period recorded in tree rings and ice cores, a moment when the world paused, when nature itself seemed to hold its breath. I crouched near a crack in the crater floor and pressed my hand to the stone. It was warm, a warning, a memory. This place does not hold ruins. It holds raw history, elemental, untamed. The people who lived nearby were coastal, nomadic. They fished, hunted, traded. And then the sky turned black. The earth split open, and fire swallowed the horizon. We find fragments of their tools buried beneath ash layers. No names, no words, just silence. But that silence speaks. It speaks of how even remote places can change the course of history, how a mountain, unseen by kings and scribes, can alter weather and memory across oceans. I climbed the inner rim as the sun broke through a veil of clouds. The Caldera lit up in gold and shadow, and for a moment, it was hard to believe this was once a place of fire and ruin. But beneath that beauty is something ancient, something unfinished. Aniakchak still breathes. It has erupted in recent centuries. Small tremors, steam, reminders. The earth does not forget. And as explorers, neither should we. Not every turning point leaves behind cities of stone or statues to crumble. Some leave only a crater, a silence, and a story waiting to be told. The jungle was thick, dense with vines and the scent of damp soil. But beneath the green, something waited. I had followed an old footpath into the highlands of El Salvador, where the trees grow tall and the silence feels heavy. The ground was soft beneath my boots, coated in centuries of leaves. But just below that ash, thick, pale, cold to the touch. This was no ordinary volcanic deposit. This was a shroud. Tierra Blanca Joven, the White Earth. 1,400 years ago, a mountain called Ilopango exploded with such fury that the world dimmed. The blast ejected so much material into the sky that the region was buried under meters of ash. The eruption reached the stratosphere, and the winds carried its mark across continents. Some believe it affected climates as far as Europe and China. Crops failed, skies turned hazy. A year without a summer, a season without a sun. But here, in this valley, the story was more personal. Before the blast, this region held a vibrant culture. Fields were tilled, markets bustled, people lived with rhythm and purpose. Then, without warning, fire consumed the sky. I found what remained of that world: pottery, charred beams, fragments of lives caught mid-motion, everything covered in a suffocating blanket of volcanic ash. There was no time to run. Ilopango did not erupt like a candle flickering out. It tore itself open, a violent plume that rose over 40 kilometers into the sky. Pyroclastic flows surged outward in all directions. Villages were erased. Rivers choked with debris. The land turned gray and silent. I brushed ash from the rim of a ceramic vessel. It was simple, beautiful, fragile, and yet it had outlasted its makers. That is the paradox of eruptions. They destroy, but they also preserve. Beneath this white layer, time stopped, like Pompeii. But here, the silence lasted longer. It stretched across generations. The people who survived must have fled far. They would have returned to a world that no longer felt like home. And yet, in time, new cultures rose. The Maya, the Pipil. But the memory of the blast lived on in legend. I walked to the edge of Lake Ilopango, its waters calm, still, but impossibly deep. A caldera lake, formed not by rain but by ruin. The volcano sleeps beneath it now, waiting. Scientists say Ilopango could erupt again. The magma chamber remains active. The region is watched. But nature does not warn in words. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lake turned silver, the forest grew quiet, and I felt it again. That hush, that breath held just before the earth speaks. Tierra Blanca Joven was not just an eruption. It was a veil, a curtain drawn over a culture, a reset pressed by fire. And yet, in the ash, we find traces of resilience. This place still speaks, not with voices, but with shadows, and with silence that remembers. The stones were warm beneath my hands, sunlit, still, but nothing here is truly silent. I walked the empty streets of Pompeii. Columns rose like broken teeth against a perfect sky. Doorways stood open to rooms that had not seen life in nearly 2,000 years. And everywhere, the ash, whispering. Vesuvius stands to the north, quiet now, shrouded in haze. But in the year 79 of the Common Era, it was anything but silent. The warning signs came slowly, tremors beneath the ground, the smell of sulfur in the air, animals restless, wells drying. But life went on. It always does, until it doesn't. Then the mountain broke open. A column of ash and gas soared into the heavens. Darkness fell at noon. Rocks rained down. Roofs collapsed. And yet, many stayed. Not from ignorance, but from disbelief. It had been centuries since Vesuvius had last stirred. The first wave was pyroclastic, a surge of fire and ash that rolled down the slopes. Fast, silent, inescapable. I passed a casting of a man curled on the ground, his body frozen in the act of covering his face, not to hide, but to hold on to breath for just one moment more. Pompeii was not the only city caught in the grip. Herculaneum, Stabii, Atlantis, all buried, all suffocated, all silenced. And then, for centuries, forgotten. I entered a home once owned by a merchant. The frescoes still shimmered with pigment. A courtyard opened to the sky. I could almost hear the footsteps, the conversations, the music. This was not a ruin. It was a pause. Ash did not just destroy. It preserved. It kept the last moments of a world intact. A world of trade and art and laughter. A world that believed it had more time. The writer Pliny the Younger watched the eruption from across the bay. He wrote of clouds shaped like pine trees, of ash piling on ships, of screams and silence. His letters remain the most vivid account of that day. But the real testimony is here, in the streets, in the kitchens where bread still sits in ovens, in the amphorae sealed with wax, in the shadows of lives unfinished. I walked to the edge of the forum, the heart of the city. Statues still stood watch, the same ones who saw the sky fall. Vesuvius looms above it all, timeless, patient. It has erupted many times since, and it will again. But no eruption since has spoken so clearly of what it means to be human, to live in the shadow of beauty and danger, to build, to hope, to vanish. I placed my hand on a wall scorched and buried by fire, and I felt it. This was not just history. This was a heartbeat, preserved in ash, waiting to be heard. ground rumbled faintly beneath my feet. Not enough to shake the earth, just enough to remind me it was alive. I stood on the blackened flank of Mount Etna, staring into a horizon softened by ash and heat. The wind carried the scent of sulfur and pine. Smoke curled from fissures in the distance. But it was not the present I had come to witness. It was the past. A past buried beneath fire. Before the Greeks, before the Roman roads wound their way through Sicily, before coins and columns and carved gods, Etna had already spoken. The land remembers, and so do the stones. Some of the oldest eruptions from this mountain happened thousands of years ago, long before history was written, before anyone knew to listen. But the signs are here. Fields of basalt stretching for miles, terraces built on hardened lava flows, ancient settlements half buried in old eruptions, places where life returned to live on scorched ground. I followed a trail where dark rock pressed against olive groves. Trees clung to the edges of old flows, their roots finding strength in cooled destruction. Farmers work these lands even now, and in the quiet, you can almost feel the memory rising from the soil. Etna's early eruptions did not just reshape the landscape, they shaped belief. The mountain was a god to some, a forge to others, a prison for giants. Myths rose with the smoke. Stories forged in the same fire that broke the earth. I wandered through the ruins of an early settlement where stone foundations still held their shape. Cracks ran through the walls. Ash sealed the corners. A culture had once lived here, close to the mountain, trusting it, or fearing it. And then came the fire. No one recorded what happened, but the evidence is everywhere. A layer of volcanic ash, charred remains, abrupt abandonment, as if the land itself turned against its people. The eruptions that came before 500 BCE were not few. Some were slow, with lava spilling across the hills. Others were violent, sudden, spitting ash and gas. We cannot know which ones ended lives and which simply reshaped them, but we know they happened, because every time I touched the ground, I felt it. The heat held in the rock, the stillness left in the wake of fire. Etna is not quiet now. It erupts often, sometimes small, sometimes not, but it always reminds the people who live here what lies beneath. The mountain is both a destroyer and a giver. Its ash enriches the soil. Its lava brings fear and fertility. Its past is written in fire, and it is far from finished. As the sun dipped behind the summit, I watched the light catch in the smoke above. Orange, red, faintly gold, like the glow of a forge deep within the earth. Etna's oldest eruptions may never be fully known, but their impact is written across centuries, in myths, in migrations, in the way people build their homes away from certain slopes. This is not just a volcano. It is a memory that breathes, a teacher that does not speak, a story still being told. And when it whispers through the earth, we listen, because Etna remembers, and so must we. Mist clung to the trees like a veil, thick, cool, laced with the scent of moss and rain. I moved through the highlands of Cameroon, where the air was heavy with moisture and the ground beneath my boots was soft from centuries of fallen leaves. The path curved upward into clouds. And then, suddenly, the trees opened. A vast depression stretched out before me. The Bambouto Caldera. From above, it looked like the earth had been cupped and hollowed by ancient hands. Green slopes cradled the basin. Steep, quiet, too quiet. 2,000 years before the Common Era, this place was not a hollow. It was a mountain, towering, alive. And then, one day, it collapsed into itself. The eruption that caused this was immense. Magma surged upward, the mountain cracked. A violent explosion reshaped everything. Ash covered the forests, rivers were choked with stone. The sky darkened over Central Africa. But here is the mystery. We know almost nothing about the people who lived near Bambouto when the fire came. There are no scrolls, no inscriptions, just whispers in the soil. I found fragments of obsidian on the Caldera's edge, sharp, dark, shards of ancient tools once used to shape wood or skin or ritual, left behind, or carried here by those who fled. The volcanic soils in this region are rich. Even now, they feed the fields that blanket the hills. Farmers tend crops where magma once flowed. But beneath the roots, the ash remains. And beneath the ash, a silence. Oral traditions from the region speak of spirits in the mountains, of fire from the sky, of gods angered and then appeased. Perhaps those stories began here. I sat on a rock overlooking the basin. Fog moved like breath across the trees. Birds called in the distance. The crater looked peaceful now. But peace is not the same as sleep. The volcano is not extinct, just resting, watching. We often forget that Africa is home to volcanoes too. We speak of Vesuvius, of Krakatoa, but here, in the heart of a continent, lies a giant whose voice once shook empires far to the north. The Bambouto eruption may not have been recorded in the books of old, but it carved itself into the bones of the land, and into the memory of the people who stayed. I stood and followed the rim, my footsteps muffled by moss. The earth beneath was warm in places, faint threads of geothermal breath rising from cracks long forgotten. This was not just a natural event. It was a turning point. A fire that erased and began. A silence that shaped the lives of those who came after. And though the caldera sleeps beneath vines and fog, it waits. Because the land always remembers, even when we do not. The air was still before dawn. Cool, blue, almost sacred. I stood beneath the towering shadow of Mount Fuji, its perfect cone cloaked in the last darkness of night. Birds had not yet begun to sing. The wind had not yet risen. There was only silence. And yet, the mountains seemed to hum. It is easy to forget that beauty and violence often share the same face. Long before shrines were built, long before samurai walked these valleys, long before the name Fuji was ever spoken, this mountain breathed fire. Around 5,000 years ago, Fuji was not yet the symbol it is today. It was young, wild, hungry, and it spoke with fire. I walked along an ancient lava flow, now covered in forest, but the ground beneath my boots was jagged, hardened, burned into place by eruptions that came before memory. Eruptions that shaped the land long before ink touched parchment in this part of the world. Ash from those earliest eruptions lies deep in the soil, black bands visible in cliff faces and riverbanks, markers of the moments when Fuji remade the land. We do not know who lived here then, but someone did. Traces of pottery, stone tools, charcoal from ancient hearths. Lives lived beneath a mountain that had not yet revealed its full nature. Imagine living in a forested valley, seasons turning with rhythm and grace. Then one day, the ground trembles. The birds vanish, the sky turns dark, and the mountain opens. Lava pours down, ash falls like snow, rivers turn hot and muddy, the world shifts. The people who lived through that must have carried the memory like fire in their blood, passed through generations until memory became story, story became myth, and the mountain became divine. Even today, Fuji is sacred. Pilgrims climb its slopes, monks pray at its base, but the mountain itself remembers differently. I pressed my hand to a boulder etched by time. Beneath the moss, the stone was smooth, melted once, forged by fire, silent now. Fuji has erupted many times since, most recently in 1707, but its earliest roars are buried deepest, in layers beneath rice fields, in the foundations of villages, in the silent awe people still feel when they look toward its peak. I climbed a narrow trail as morning light finally touched the summit. Gold lit the snow, the sky turned soft with color. It was easy to believe the mountain was eternal, but mountains grow, and mountains burn. The Fuji of 5,000 years ago was not the Fuji we know. It was raw, untamed. It shaped the people who lived in its shadow, and perhaps they shaped it too, in memory. Volcanoes are not just explosions. They are mirrors. They show us how quickly the world can change and how deeply we try to understand it. As I descended, mist began to curl along the forest floor. The silence returned, but it was not empty. It was full of stories, of fire, of beginnings. And the mountain, quiet once more, watched without blinking. The tundra stretched wide, open, lonely, endless. I stood between two silent craters, twin scars on the land, as if something had reached up from beneath and clawed its way out. The ground was soft with moss, yet the air still carried a faint sting of sulfur. This was the site of the Ukinrek Mars. Two volcanic pits, not towering cones, not grand calderas, just holes. Yet the story they tell is anything but small. Roughly 3,000 years ago, in what is now southwestern Alaska, these Mars erupted in tandem. Steam-driven, sudden, violent. The earth split open, throwing ash and rock into the sky. Boiling groundwater mixed with rising magma. The explosions were not from lava, but from pressure, raw and immediate. The blasts formed craters nearly 100 meters deep, and then, just as quickly, the fury stopped. But something remained. I walked the rim of the western Mar. The slope was steep, slick with fine gravel and lichen. Water pooled at the bottom, reflecting the sky in a pale mirror. Birds circled overhead, crying in the wind. There were no cities here to bury, no temples to fall, just wild land, untouched. But that did not mean no one was watching. The people of this region lived close to the land. They followed the rhythms of ice and migration. They knew the language of the earth long before science tried to name it. What did they see that day? A flash on the horizon, a shudder in the ground, a column of ash rising where yesterday there was only grass, animals fleeing, rivers darkened with soot, and then silence. We find no writings, no carvings, but perhaps we find the echo in stories passed down through generations, stories of fire, of holes that appeared overnight, of land that could not be trusted. The Mars are young by geological standards, but in human terms, they are ancient, formed at a time when our ancestors were already building, already dreaming, already writing parts of the world into permanence. Yet here, in this forgotten corner, the Earth reminded us how quickly permanence can dissolve. I sat on the edge of the eastern crater. The wind pulled at my coat. The landscape rolled away in frozen quiet. But beneath that stillness, the Earth was not dead. The Ukinrek Mars erupted again in 1977, a modern event, witnessed, measured, photographed. But their twin origins remain older, stranger, shaped in a time when we were not watching, when nature moved without audience. And perhaps that is the lesson they offer. Not all eruptions bring down empires. Some simply appear, quietly, powerfully, leaving questions where once there was only ground. The Ukinrek Mars are not monuments. They are openings, windows into the pulse beneath us. And standing there, between them, I felt it. That the Earth is never still, only waiting. The water was calm, too calm. It rippled gently under a pale sky, giving no hint of the violence beneath. I stood on the cliffs of northern Santorini, staring out over the sea. Somewhere beyond the reach of the eye, beneath 70 meters of water, lies Colombo, a volcano that sleeps beneath the waves. And once, it screamed. Around 1600 years before the Common Era, Colombo erupted, not on land, not in sight, but deep beneath the surface of the Aegean Sea. At first, there would have been nothing, just strange tremors. Rumblings felt in the bones of boats and in the hollow drums of seabirds. Then, the sea began to rise. A column of ash and gas tore through the surface. Steam billowed into the sky. The eruption was sudden, explosive, unseen until it was too late. Columbo is often mentioned alongside the eruption of Thera. Some scholars believe it is part of the same event. Others argue it was distinct, a separate catastrophe, a second breath of the same restless earth. Either way, it changed the sea. I listened to the waves brush against the rocks below. Somewhere out there, nearly 4 kilometers from the shore, the seafloor still bears the crater, over 3 kilometers wide. It is not visible from land, but it waits. Its silence holds weight. Columbo's eruption sent shockwaves across the Aegean. It likely triggered tsunamis. Ash fell on distant islands. The sea boiled, fish floated to the surface, the sky turned dark, and then it sank. The eruption hollowed out the seabed. The crater collapsed inward. What once roared now rests beneath layers of silt and memory. I spoke to divers who have explored the rim. They describe towering cliffs beneath the waves, fissures still venting heat, microbial life thriving in chemical vents. The volcano sleeps, but it does not forget. In 1650, Columbo stirred again. A new eruption. Ships rocked in the harbor. The sea turned violent. Dozens died. Santorini trembled. It was a reminder that the deep can awaken at any time. And yet, it remains out of sight. Unlike Thera, Columbo has no painted ruins, no buried city, only absence, a void beneath the sea. But its impact was no less real. I imagined what it would have looked like. A column of water thrown high into the sky, clouds of steam blotting out the sun, the ocean recoiling in waves, silence broken by thunder from below. The people who lived here then left no records of Columbo, but perhaps they remembered it as a second blow, a shadow that followed fire, a sign that the gods were still not done. As I turned from the cliffside, the sea shimmered gold in the setting sun, peaceful, serene, but deceptive, because Columbo is not gone. It is being watched, monitored, studied. Its vents still release gas, its heart still moves. Beneath the beauty of the Aegean lies a monster shaped in steam and salt, a volcano not lost, but hidden. And hidden things have a way of returning. Columbo is a silence that waits to be broken. And when it does, the sea will speak. The sun was low over the Anatolian plains, soft, golden, unmoving. I stood beneath the wide shadow of Mount Hassan. Its twin peaks loomed quietly over the land. Their slopes faded into ochre fields dotted with shrubs and scattered stones. The mountain looked peaceful, but the earth beneath my feet told another story. This was once a place of fire. Nearly 10,000 years ago, before metal, before writing, before the first kings dreamed of walls and crowns, Mount Hassan erupted, a blast that painted the sky with ash and turned fertile ground to stone. Yet what makes this eruption remarkable is not just its power. It is the people who lived beside it. Just to the northeast, the remains of Çatalhöyük rise from the earth, one of the oldest known cities. Mud brick homes pressed close together, murals on the walls, shrines beneath the floor. Life growing in layers. And above them, always, the mountain. I walked through the excavated ruins, careful where I stepped. The wind moved gently through the reeds and dry grass. I touched a wall still marked by the hands of Neolithic artists. On that plaster, a painting, 2 peaks, a city, and in the sky, fire. Some believe it is the oldest depiction of a volcanic eruption. The people of Çatalhöyük may have watched as Mount Hassan erupted. They may have seen fire leap from its summit, ash fall from the sky. Perhaps they fled, perhaps they prayed, but they remembered. Their memory became art. Their fear became symbol. I climbed partway up the slope of the mountain. Loose stones shifted beneath me. Volcanic rock crunched underfoot. The view stretched far across the plain, a land once rich with obsidian. The black glass scattered across fields like stars fallen to earth. That obsidian came from the mountain too, carved into blades, traded far beyond these hills, a gift from the volcano. Even as it threatened life, it also gave tools, beauty, worth. That is the balance of mountains like Hassan. They destroy, and they create. The eruption of 7,500 BCE is not fully understood. The records are not written in stone, but in soil, in the shape of the land, in the memories of those who dared to build beneath its gaze. The ash layer from the blast is still visible in core samples, a thin line marking a moment when everything changed, when the sky went dark, when the earth reminded its earliest children that the ground could rise in anger. Yet they stayed, they rebuilt, they painted, they honored. I reached a quiet ridge where the wind stopped. Just for a moment, the silence was complete, and in that stillness, I felt it. This was not just a mountain. It was a guardian, a god, a threat, a teacher. Mount Hassan may never erupt again, or it may do so tomorrow. That is the nature of such places. Ancient, restless, watching. And those who once lived here understood. Long before science, long before myth, they looked to the peaks and saw something more, something sacred, something dangerous, something alive. The eruption is over, the fire is gone, but the memory, carved into the oldest city we have ever found, still burns. The dust still clung to my boots when I packed my journal away. 15 volcanoes, 15 echoes in the bones of the earth. Each eruption left more than ash. It left absence. It left questions. It left the trace of lives interrupted mid-step. From the frozen plains of Alaska to the sunlit cliffs of Santorini, we followed the footprints of those who stood beneath rising clouds and watched their world vanish. They did not leave behind monuments of power. They left something quieter, a half-buried home, a shattered bowl, a painting on a wall. These volcanoes were not just natural events. They were turning points. Each one collapsed more than landscapes. They shifted timelines, fractured empires, redefined survival. And yet, the people endured. They fled, rebuilt, and remembered. In stories, in soil, in silence. Sometimes they prayed. Sometimes they painted. Sometimes they simply disappeared. I have come to believe that history does not always whisper. Sometimes it waits. Beneath water, beneath ash, beneath the calm of a mountain that seems to sleep. We look at these places and see the past. But the earth does not know past or future. Only motion, only pressure, only release. Each crater, each caldera, each buried city is a chapter. Not in destruction, but in transformation. I left the last site at twilight. The sky faded into indigo. The wind carried no sound, but deep inside, I felt it. That pulse, that breath, that knowledge, that we walk not on solid ground, but on the edge of memory. And though the volcanoes sleep, the fire beneath them does not. This journey was not an ending. It was an invitation to listen more closely, to dig more carefully, to remember more honestly. Because beneath every field, beneath every stone, beneath every silence, the earth remembers. And now, so do we.